alongside just immigration in general that has negative consequences, is the rise of radical Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the entrenchment of, in particular, the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a force that wants to transform the countries that it has established itself in. It wants to transform Britain from being an open, liberal, democratic society to a Sharia-based society. They have put down mosques and Islamic centers and schools. They have taken down whole neighborhoods, and they think that they can get their message across and transform the population and the reality in Britain through more immigration and through demands that they make that the same politicians give to them that they don't give to the white working class. So the social cohesion, this immigration is affecting negatively the social cohesion between the people who lived in this country, in the host society, and the immigrants who come. And on top of that, radical political Islam is also driving a wedge between peoples and between politicians and the people they govern over. It's a hot mess.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Well, this show is called Outspoken, and I can't think of a better guest because you have been outspoken in a way that has put your security, your own life at threat for many, many years. And I hope you don't mind, but I want to talk first about what is going on in the UK, because you have been such an important voice against extremism now for the past 2 decades. And what we're seeing here is a destruction of our society, yet anyone who seems to challenge what's happening or questions the narrative is now immediately branded as far right. And I watched last week our Home Secretary at the Labour Party conference spend an hour talking about the threat of the so-called riots that we had in the UK after the Southport massacre, and not mention once the growing threat of Islamic extremism, which we know through MI5 is by far the bigger threat to Brits. So what is your take on what is happening here in the UK?
Well, first of all, very lovely to meet you, Dan, and thank you very much for having me
I'm
on.
so glad to have you.
I think it is, it's how you frame the problem. And what's interesting about your question, it is, you know, when you asked your question, you said what's happening in the UK. And I really want to reframe it and say what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the West, in relation to what we label immigration and the presence of Islam. And what I see, let's stick with the UK as an example, but it's happening in France and in Germany, in the US, all across the West. What you have is an ideological approach to having people leave poor countries, third world countries, and come to Europe or so-called rich countries. Rich countries are actually not rich anymore. 30 years ago, you could argue that Britain was rich, but today Britain is not a rich country. And so you have an ideological drive to attract immigrants, to attract people from poor countries to rich countries, alongside a practical approach, which is, look, our economy needs immigrants. The sorts of immigrants that the economy needs are not the people who are coming in large numbers. And then you have the reaction from the host society to this unplanned, uncoordinated, crazy immigration, just large numbers of people coming in and asking for asylum. And sometimes often they're rejected, but the rejection doesn't amount to anything. because they don't leave the country. And the push factors, the issues that are pushing them away from their homelands are getting bigger and bigger. These people come from Africa, from the Middle East, from South Asia, countries that are poorly run, with terrible economies, with conflict, societies that are breaking down. And so you understand why it's attractive for young men living in these parts of the world to want to go somewhere else. Then you have to look at the pull factors. And in particular, look at the welfare society, the welfare arrangements that so-called rich countries like Britain have, which if you're living in a poor country, if you're told over social media and over any kind of correspondence with the relatives that you have abroad, hey, if you come here, you can count on free housing, free education, free healthcare, free anything and free everything. And you have no clue who's paying for this. It's just free. And you're told by the people smugglers, if you pay me a little bit, I'll get you across this border, that channel, and I'll get you in. And then you have the ideological left that has this elaborate set of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are incentivized to keep the problem going. Because if they solve the problem, then they don't have jobs. They don't have a source of income. And at the very end, you have a huge negative unintended consequence of this movement of populations from poor countries to rich countries. And almost all of it, all the negative stuff lands on the shoulders of the poor and the working class whites. And when they protest, and the only ways that they're able to protest is actually to vote. And if you look at every country, what many of these people have been doing is simply voting for the parties and the political leaders who say immigration is a problem and we're going to do something about it. So then they are labeled xenophobic and far right.
But even worse, Ayaan, in the UK, if you're voted for those parties, which we have, the Conservative Party, which pledged to bring immigration down to the tens of thousands, the vote for Brexit so that we could take back control of our borders. So actually, our democratic vote has been completely ignored as well. So we actually don't even have that to fall back on, which I believe is why there is this bubbling anger.
There's this bubbling anger where people who are negatively affected by this form of immigration, some people rightfully call it an invasion.
I do.
People who are negatively affected by this sort of immigration have their backs to the wall. Voting doesn't help. Their voice is meaningless in the sense that nothing. This is election after election after election. They see that nothing happens. The problems get worse. They get more and more immigrants put amongst them. And I think, Dan, part of this is that there is this, you saw it with Brexit. There's this cleavage, this, I'd say, disconnection between the people who make the decisions, so-called elite, and the people who are governed. And the people who make the decisions don't seem to be affected by the negative consequences of immigration. They don't understand it. They don't live in the neighborhoods. It's not their children's schools that are affected. They don't have to stand and wait in line for very limited healthcare resources. They're not affected by the crime. They're not affected by the grime. So they can sit in their sort of wonderful, comfortable homes and offices and preach to the general public about being generous and open and cosmopolitan and all these other reasons, so that they put together to say, here's why we can continue with these policies, or here's why we ignore you, because that's really what it is. It's ignoring the general population. But then alongside that, alongside just immigration in general that has negative consequences, is the rise of radical Islam. And it is the entrenchment of, in particular, the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a force that wants to transform the countries that it has established itself in. It wants to transform Britain from being an open, liberal, democratic society to a Sharia-based society. They have put down mosques and Islamic centers and schools. They have taken down whole neighborhoods, and they think that they can get their message across and transform the population and the reality in Britain through more immigration and through demands that they make that the same politicians give to them that they don't give to the white working class. So the social cohesion, this immigration is affecting negatively the social cohesion between the people who lived in this country, in the host society, and the immigrants who come. And on top of that, radical political Islam is also driving a wedge between peoples and between politicians and the people they govern over. It's a hot mess.
It is a hot mess. No, indeed, it is. Because the thing is, you have this elite class that you talk about, Ayaan, and actually, even if you now question extreme Islam. So, for example, as a gay man, I don't feel comfortable with lots of the tenets of this religion, and I have spoken to those who have been de-radicalized, having been born in the UK, and they are told in their teachings just down the road from where I used to live in East London that gay men should be shoved off the top of buildings. This is not some sort of exaggeration. This is actually going on in the UK today, and a lot of these folk are UK born. But we have a new government, Ayaan, that actually wants to make me even saying that illegal because of the talk of the introduction of Islamophobia to actually become hate speech, to actually be something that you could be arrested for. So it feels like everything the mechanisms of the establishment do are to push down and actually stop any discussion about exactly what you've just outlined.
I think there is, and again, there is the establishment, sort of is what you might think of as a system or the system, and then the individuals that operate within it. And so, of course, individual politicians do listen to the population, and they do raise the issues that you're raising, the intolerance among Islamists, the numbers, the scale of the immigration and the scope of it, the breakdown in the integration process that just never happens. But then those individual politicians, individuals within the media, they are shut down by a system that on an ideological level either wants this thing to continue or has reached a point where it really doesn't have an answer and is worried that any kind of conversation about the problem may break the system down. I think that there's this deep-seated fear that if we talk honestly and openly about the problems that are emanating from this unwanted large-scale immigration, the rise of radical Islam, this incredibly terrible tension and this rising tension between Muslims who are extreme and non-Muslims who are affected, like the gay communities, like women,
yes,
like the Jewish community, that if we have these conversations, that we're going to make the problem worse. So the system wants to control things. And the only way that they can control things is to shut down conversation. This is the shutting down of the freedom of speech. But it's not going to work. It's all going to go underground, and the tension is just going to build and build. And we know from history, when you get that level of tension build up, that is resentment between groups of communities within an established nation, but the things really do get out of control. And I think there is a very real risk that the extremes, whether they are the extreme right wing or the extreme jihadists, are going to hijack reality, and they're going to go at each other, and the establishment is going to be squeezed out and will be onlookers looking really, really bad and being ineffective.
Well,
And
Elon
you see this in
Musk,
many different places.
Elon Musk used the term civil war. He thinks that's inevitably coming to the UK. Where do you stand on that?
I think Elon Musk is giving us a warning. He obviously has lived in Africa. I also come from Africa.
Yes, which I want to
So
talk about.
I think what we share is if you have this accumulation of resentment between different groups within society, and the tension just keeps going up and up, it's highly likely that they will go at one another. And it is absolutely right. I don't know if Elon said this or not, but what we call multiculturalism, this fantasy that you have groups of different religions and cultures that are beautifully coexisting alongside one another and doing this peacefully, that's just a fantasy. That has failed. Angela Merkel had said it, David Cameron had said it. We know that there is no such a thing as multiculturalism. The reality is we have these multi-ethnic communities that are living alongside one another. And then there is this religious community, and not every Muslim is a problem.
No.
It's absolutely untrue to say all Muslims are a problem. That's not the case. But there is an organized political Islam that is very aggressive and that will not rest until it dominates. And that group is playing with fire. They are antagonizing the local populations. This happened in the former Yugoslavia. And I'm old enough to know, and so is Elon, and so are a number of people who have known exactly where that led. So if you want to prevent something like that from happening in Britain and in France and in Germany, you better address these issues. The sooner we address these issues, the better. The sooner we articulate that Britain is never, ever going to be a Muslim country. It's never going to have Sharia as its laws and its norms, that we have our own norms and our own culture and our laws and our way of doing things. And that you coming from outside, you have to abide by those laws or leave. The sooner we start to articulate this and enforce it, I think the sooner we can avoid disaster.
But first, it's the best time of year. Football is back. We're talking Premier League in the UK and in the US, NFL Sundays and college football Saturdays. With that, the glorious kind of fantasy football lineups is back too. So it's where your inner manager comes alive, setting the perfect fantasy roster, screaming at your TV and making last-minute waiver moves that either make you a hero or the guy everyone ridicules in the group chat. But listen, while you're over here making sure your fantasy team is dialed in, don't let your personal grooming become the guy that gets left on the bench, because let's be honest, nobody wants to fumble their grooming routine. So that's where Manscaped's Performance Package 5.0 Ultra comes in, acting as your all-in-one grooming playbook. From keeping things sharp down below with the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra to taking care of those rogue ear and nose hairs with the Weed Whacker 2.0, this is the lineup that'll keep you looking and feeling like a champ on and off the field. It will help you feel clean, confident, and ready to dominate your fantasy league. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra Groin and Body Hair Trimmer is the franchise player of your grooming roster with precise trimming capabilities. It's reliable, efficient, and gets the job done without fumbling. Whether it's for a date night, weekend tailgate, or just everyday grooming, this is the tool you want on your squad. And no one wants a surprise nose or ear hair making a guest appearance on game day, right? So look at this. The Weed Whacker 2.0 handles those details like a pro, keeping you neat and ready to go. No missed tackles in your grooming game. And 2 free gifts today. The Boxers 2.0 Midnight Bravo and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag Premium Gear to ensure you're always ready for action, whether at home or on the road. So join the over 10 million men. I'm one of them who trust Manscaped, and get ready for kickoff by heading over to manscaped.com. All you need to do is use the code Outspoken, that's at checkout, and you'll get 20% off and free shipping. Trust me, you'll be drafting the real MVP of grooming this season. So 20% off and free shipping when you use the code Outspoken at www.manscaped.com. Stay on top of your grooming game and be ready for anything the season throws your way. But Ayaan, our new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has branded people who have said just that, including people like me, by the way, a centrist, really, or at least considered a centrist a few years ago, as being part of the far right. He says you're just a snake oil salesperson.
Yeah. these accusations of far right and racist and so on, they're losing their potency. 10 years ago, if you called someone a racist, they would think about committing suicide. That was how harsh this term was. It's the kind of power it had. It was like a spell, but that spell is broken. Everybody now knows that the person who's using the word racist or xenophobe or Islamophobe, that they are the ones who are corrupt or inept and incompetent. And it is this combination of ideology, ineptitude, and corruption that has brought us where we are. And Keir Starmer and his government are either incompetent, they don't know what to do, and they do have, in many ways, you can see the UK government doesn't seem to be up to the job of governing, not just on the immigration issue, but you can see it in other areas as well. But amongst them, they also have ideological groups, and I want to name two of them.
Please.
It's the Reds and the Greens. They have the Greens, the Islamists, who voted for Labour as a means of getting to the next step in what they think of as the Islamization process of Britain. And then, of course, you have these Reds, the ones who, communists, Marxists, the woke, who believe that Britain itself is a product of exploitation and oppression and has to be brought down. The system has to be dismantled and deconstructed. So the radical left on the side of Labour. So Labour, the Labour Party, like other left-wing parties all across the West, is a home to these two extreme forms, the revolutionary socialists and the Islamists. And these two groups form a coalition that they call the Watermelon or the Red-Green Coalition. And so Keir Starmer is now confronted with how to deal with these mega problems that occurred before he came into office, number one. And number two, how to deal with these extremist groups within his party. And he better have the balls to do that.
Yeah, well, I don't think he does, because he just wants to shut down discussion. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please do subscribe if you want lots more clips and interviews like that. Plus, if you want to watch our totally uncensored after show, then visit www.outspoken.live.